Good afternoon, everybody, including the senior advocates who are present, my beloved advocate friends and judges. And on behalf of Lex webinar series and MMBA, the Elite Bar of Madurai Bench of Madras High Court, who is going to co-host the webinar along with us, we welcome one and all. The topic of the day is very important and the resource person is more important. He has been a proven, I would rather use the word stalwart without exaggeration, in whatever topics he deliberates. And I still remember the speech he has delivered in MMBA 4 or 5 years back about the journey of the Constitution of India, starting from A.K. Gopalan's case till NJAC. And it is still fresh in our memory. And today we are going to have his rich speech on doctrines of constitutional interpretations, a topic which is very much relevant for the day and the present condition of the nation. I would say the nation wants to know. So now may I request Mr. Nirmal, the convener of MMBA, to introduce the chief guest before formally commencing the program. Nirmal, you are welcome.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Good evening to one and all. Our chief guest, Mr. Aravind P. Dattar, is a senior advocate of Madras High Court. Completed his BSc Honours from the University of Bombay and BL degree from the University of Madras. And qualified cost and work accountants. Joined the bar in 1980. Worked as a junior to Mrs. Ramani Natarajan and later joined the office of Subraya Iyer, Padmanabhan and Ramamani. Set up his independent practice in 1984 and practiced various tax tribunals and the company law board, high courts and Supreme Court. Now presently practicing before the Supreme Court and has appeared in several important cases on taxational law and constitutional law. Apart from his active practice, he is also there is also the author of Dattar on the Constitution of India, Guide to Central Excise Law, and Practice and Guide to Central Excise Procedures. Chief Guest has written over 150 articles for various journals and newspapers, and also a general editor of Ramaya Guide to the Companies Act and chief editor of the 11th edition of Ganga and Palkiwala's Law and Practice of Income Tax, and also the co-author of The Courtroom Genius, written along with Soliji Sorabji. This book details the important cases dealt with by Sri Palkiwala, and also the general editor of Essay and Reminiscent in honor of Nani A. Palkiwala, published on the occasion of birth century of N.A. Palkiwala. In addition to SAR's practice and writing, also visiting faculty at the Institute of Chartered Account of India, Institute of Company Secretaries of India, Institute of Cost and Work Accounts of India, and Bardhasan University of Management, Trichy, and also being visiting faculty at the National Judicial Academy at Bhopal and Tamil Nadu Judicial Academy at Chennai, and deliver guest lectures at the Cambridge University, the University of Cape Town, South Africa, the Indian Institute of Management, Kozhikode, and various law schools. Our chief guest has founded trustee of Palkiwala Foundation, Chennai, and director of Nani Palkiwala Arbitration Center, Chennai, and former joint secretary of Tamil Nadu Mediation and Conciliation Center, Madras High Court, Chennai. Thank you, sir. Thank you for giving this opportunity by Mr. Srinivasan Ravan, sir, and Ms. Krishnaveni, madam, president of MMBA. And now I ask Mr. Srinivasan Ravan to continue the schedule.
Thank you, Mr. Nirmal, for the introduction. Without wasting much time, may I request Mr. Dattar to start his deliberation. Sir, you are welcome. The forum is yours, sir.
Thank you so much, Mr. Srinivasan Ravan. And it is nice to be speaking to my colleagues in the Madurai Bar. I have very pleasant memories of visiting that court. I think I came there last year as an amicus in the TikTok matter. And before that, I had the occasion of coming there for some tax matters from time to time. I see some of my colleagues, Mr. Shivakumar is there. I see other colleagues, Mr. Vishwanathan and other friends are there. And nice to see all of you. More than a lecture, I'll be basically sharing my thoughts. All of you are well versed in the subject of the Constitution of India. And sometimes what I say may be very obvious to you, may be very basic, kindly pardon me. I just try to highlight those things which will be useful for us in the day-to-day practice. as somebody who's been appearing in matters under Article 226 or under 232, I have always been fascinated by this subject of constitutional law. Now, what I did was, knowing it's a Saturday afternoon, and this is not, this is not a something all of us may not find it so exciting. I thought of making some slides, which all of you can follow. And in case you have some questions, you can please put them to me. I'll answer it to the best of my ability. Now, when you first talk of constitutional interpretation, when we were in law college, we were one of the last 3-year batches. In the third year, you could choose insolvency, insurance, interpretation. And I had taken the subject of interpretation. And from there, my fascination for the subject of interpretation continues till today after almost 41 years of practice. Now, when you talk of interpretation and constitutional interpretation, is there something different as far as the Constitution is concerned vis-a-vis ordinary statutory interpretation? Now, first of all, why interpretation? As Lord Denning said, you can't draft a statute with divine prescience. A draftsman cannot prepare a statute covering all possible contingencies, all possible eventualities, and therefore the need for interpretation comes. It may come in a tax statute, it may come in a statute relating to, say, service law or in, civil law, commercial law, Transfer of Property Act, and so on and so forth. Now, first of all, as far as constitutional interpretation is concerned, why is it particularly important as far as India is concerned? See, first of all, you should if you see the first slide, which I have put up, I have asked the manager, what do you call that, admin in charge of the program to put up the first slide. We'll have to first understand our constitution, in what background it was prepared, and then you'll find out. You see, when the Constituent Assembly was first formed, there was a question as to what should they do. Should they follow the Westminster model? Should they follow a presidential form of government? And they took a momentous decision that they will follow the Westminster model, where there is an upper house, there is a lower house, there is a president who is like the Queen, who is a symbolic head. Then they also said that England is not a federal structure, it's a small country. But they said we'll adopt the systems of federalism because it's too large a country to be governed by one person. So federalism was adopted. You will notice that as far as the Government of India Act is concerned, till the slide comes up, I'll tell you. Take it from me that 80% of our constitution is a reproduction of the Government of India Act. The 3 schedules, list 7, Schedule 7, list 1, list 2, list 3 is from the Government of India Act. Article 246 is a replica of Article 199 and so on and so forth. Article 366 definitions is equal to Article 366. So many provisions were there. Now, at the start, you had 395 articles, 8 schedules, and 80% of it is there. Now, from to 2020, with almost 103, 104 amendments, we now have 425 articles, and we have 12 schedules. And 104 amendments were there. There were totally 125 bills. Some bills lapsed, some bills continued, and this is the position. One important point I'd like to draw attention to is a masterly speech by Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar on 4th November 1948, where many assembly members, including Pandit Nehru, they criticized this lengthy constitution which was supposed to be adopted. They said, why should a constitution be so lengthy? It is not like an statute. And they said, let us have a constitution which gives the broad principles, equality, fraternity, etc., and leave it for the courts to debate. So that was a big question. Do we have what is called a value-driven constitution, where the constitution only frames broad values? You see the German constitution, for example. You see the American constitution. What it says, there shall be life, liberty, etc., and the pursuit of happiness. If you take the Article 1, there shall be freedom of speech. The state shall not promote any religion. Simple, broad statements are made. Dr. Ambedkar pointed out that we are an infant democracy. We have the Holocaust of the partition. We have multiple languages, multiple communities, different states. it is virtually many countries within one country. And he said that it will be wrong to adopt the US Constitution, which is almost 200 years old, or the British conventions which have been come from the Magna Carta. He said, and he used the word constitutional morality, which has been used by Dicey. All of us remember we have studied Dicey on the Constitution in Law College. Dicey uses the word constitutional morality, and that is used in the sense of constitutional convention. There are certain conventions. The Queen makes a speech every year. If you lose election, you leave the office. You have certain, where the bills are presented to Parliament, they go for discussion. All these are not there in any written form in the English Constitution. These are all conventions. And he uses the word constitutional morality to say that every party agrees to follow certain norms, certain conventions, certain practices. That is the constitutional morality. Like we say, I've got a moral obligation. I don't say I have a statutory obligation. I have a moral obligation. Why? There's nothing in writing. But as a member of civilized society, I adhere to certain principles. So he says we do not have constitutional morality. We are a young democracy. He didn't mean that we are immoral people. He said we don't have a practice of healthy conventions, and therefore I am going ahead with the long constitution. If you get the time, please go to the Constituent Assembly debate. They're on the net. And on 4th November, it's a speech of 4 to 5 pages where he discusses why he is adopting a lengthy constitution. So we now have a long constitution. And despite whatever people say, I think it's a fantastic document. It is not a joke. In fact, to draft this particular constitution, the chapter on fundamental rights, the chapter on directive principles, if you sit, pause and think, we don't realize what a treasure we have got. This is basically the life and the oxygen of our country lies in part 3 and part 4 of our constitution, the fundamental rights and directive principles. Now, if you come to the next slide, first of all, why do we need interpretation? As I said, it will be a divine person who can draft a law which will be free from doubt, free from ambiguity. Let me give you 2 examples. In 1990, the US Supreme Court delivered 129 judgments. Now, you know, the US Supreme Court normally decides about 100 cases per year. And these cases, by and large, have to be certified by 1/3 the number of judges as raising very important questions of law, because everything gets over at the federal court. So in a constitution where very serious constitutional matters come for consideration on a very high level, on very few levels, out of 129 judgments, the verdict was 5:4 in 37 cases. So just imagine, approximately in about 1/3 or 1/2 the cases, sorry, 1/3 the number of cases, slightly less than 1/3. One-third the number of cases, the court was divided, and divided how? 5:4, narrowly divided. Therefore, that underscores the need for the constitution interpretation to say that a statute, a provision of the constitution, can have diverse views. One word can be interpreted this way. So just imagine in 37 cases, if the verdict was the other way around, the entire law would have changed. So that itself shows that English is an imperfect language. Any language is imperfect. And that is why you need there's a need for interpretation. And if there's interpretation, there will be principles of interpretation. One can't have some kind of a wildlife situation where anybody can interpret whichever way he likes. One has a legitimate expectation that statutes will be interpreted in certain principles according to certain guidelines. There will be a strict interpretation, purpose of interpretation, and so on. Therefore, the need for interpretation is based on the difficulty in the language. And other thing is, what was drafted in 1950 may not hold the field in 2020. What is called updating construction. Society may change, norms may change, but the words will be the same. What was life and liberty in 1950 may become now. For example, 377. Same-sex marriage relationship was unheard of in those days. Today, on the basis of medical evidence, they say that it is part of a biological issue. There's nothing criminal about it. This is how it is changed. One example I'm giving. Now, take our own constitution, take our own Supreme Court. There is a book by Mr. Govind Goyal, who is the brother of Justice A.K. Goel. He has tabulated the book in 2 volumes. You should have a copy. He has tabulated how many times 5-judge bench have been constituted, 7 judges, 9 judges, and so on. So mind you, you go to 7, if there are 2 5-judges benches which conflict, it goes to 7 judges. Recently, the question whether you can make sub-classification for scheduled caste, scheduled tribes, Chinnaya's judgment has been doubted. It has gone to 7 judges. Indira Sani, Mandal Commission went to 9 judges. TMFI went to 11 judges. Similarly, privacy issue went to
11 judges.
Shabrimala has gone to 7 judges. So these judgments have gone to court. Now just see the statistic. In our from 1950 to 2015, there's been 113 judges. Of course, all of us know this case in Bharati. The Supreme Court has had 11 judge benches 8 times, 9 judges 15 times, 7 judges 83 times, 6 judges 48 times, and 5 judge, please listen, 5 judge bench has been constituted 2,139 times up to 2015. By now it would have been crossed 2,200 also. So just imagine, in 65 years, on 2,000 plus occasions, there was a need to interpret the constitution. There was a doubt as to what a particular provision meant. Somebody challenged it. It first comes to 2 judges or comes to 3 judges. They feel, yes, it requires a constitutional interpretation. It has now gone to 5 judges. I did the Maratha reservation in the Bombay High Court and we came to the Supreme Court. Now the issue is under Article 342. There is a new National Commission for Backward Classes. The question is, with the amendment to the 102nd Amendment to the Constitution, have the states lost their power to classify people for backward class? That is the important question, because that Article 342 is not clear, 338 is not clear. It has now gone to 5 judges. Therefore, there is a need for constitutional interpretation, because different situations arise, different viewpoints take place, and there is a need for interpretation. Now, statutory versus constitutional interpretation. There are judgments which say a statute is different, constitution is different. My personal view is the best proposition is laid down by Hidayatullah in Chandra Mohan's case, where he says fundamental rules are the same, whether it's a contract act or a constitution. Fundamental rules are the same, but there is one caveat. There is one important caveat. I was told by a senior lawyer in the Supreme Court, Mr. R.K. Garg was once arguing a case, and while he was arguing, some judge was speaking to each other, the bench was speaking. Then he said, my lords, please, the barrack was a yellow barrack, Constitution said, please keep the yellow barrack down. So when you interpret in the Constitution, we require a vision. What we say today is going to affect 500 million people, 600 million people. So when you interpret the Constitution, you must know what is the consequences on society as a whole. When you say reservation cannot cross 50%, what is the implication of that? When you say Article 14 includes arbitrariness, what is the consequence? When you say Shabrimala, the right to equality will apply even to temples and prayers, what is the consequence? So all these are also important issues which may not arise in an Income Tax Act or a Customs Act, but they arise in a constitution, namely, what is the vision, what is the impact of our judgment for this generation and the next generation? That has to be always kept in mind. Now, I see some chats. You can ask me questions after I finish. Yes. So for our purpose of discussion, in our Constitution, Article 367 is the interpretation section. It makes it clear that the General Clause Act applies. Yesterday, last week, for the last 2 weeks, I was appearing for the National Broadcasting Association in this Sushant Singh Rajput murder case in the Bombay High Court. And the whole issue was media trial. We had to interpret Article 19(1)(a), free speech and expression, with Article 19(2). Now, if you have got 19(2), the right to free speech and expression is subject to certain limitations. One limitation is the law of contempt. All right. If you see 19(2), one is the law of contempt. I was very interested or very fascinated to learn that the law of contempt does not only mean the Contempt of Courts Act 1971. In the Sahara case, the 5-judge bench we discussed media trial and prior restraint. They said contempt includes common law of contempt. What is common law of contempt? the law laid down by the British courts before independence and by the judges is the common law of contempt. And the common law of contempt says contempt will not arise only when the charge sheet is filed. Even at the pre-trial stage, the court's jurisdiction at the pre-trial stage is not taken away. So just the common example, how we interpreted it. Law of contempt is mentioned in 1902. What is law? We think law means a parliamentary enactment. But the Supreme Court says law also includes common law. Similarly, in General Clause Act, I was happy to see judgments in 52, 56, 60, which say, when you say laws in force, in Article 367, laws in force mean common law also. What was the judge-made law prevailing in 1950 also prevailed. And I may just tell you as a matter of information, every Privy Council, Article 141 is binding, right? Supreme Court judgment is binding on all of it. It's been laid down that if there is a Privy Council judgment and there is no contrary Supreme Court judgment, that is also equally applicable and binding. Now go to the next slide. Now these are general principles. You will remember your law college days. Every statute is presumed to be constitutional. The very fact that it's presumption means it's rebuttable. For example, when an amendment is made, it is presumed to be constitutional. When the National Judicial Appointments Commission Act came, it is presumed to be constitutional. But the five judges struck it down, saying it violates the basic structure. And one other point I will mention here. In ordinary statutes, you can strike it down as being violative of Part 3, fundamental rights, or a constitutional limitation, like say Article 265, Article 300A. It can be violative because it lacks legislative competence. For example, state cannot levy a tax in the union list, vice versa. Now a big question is, central government has passed a farm bill, other state governments have passed bills to the contrary. What is the legislative competence? So that again has to be checked up. So presumption of constitutionality is there, but it can be rebutted in different ways. But the point I'm making is, while ordinary statutes can be struck down on different grounds, please note that if it's a constitutional amendment, the only ground of challenge is violation of basic structure. Apart from violation of basic structure, you cannot challenge a constitutional amendment at all. Now come to broad and liberal construction. This is again a principle that when the constitution is prepared, it has to be interpreted broadly and liberally. Life, liberty, and Article 21 say the word of meaning of income in entry 82 of list 1. Let us say other subjects in the schedules. What is the meaning of these words should be interpreted liberally. Now, legislative practice. You can, if you got a piece of paper, you can make a note. Entry 54 of list 2 said tax on sale or purchase of goods. We commonly call it sales tax. Sale has not been defined in the Constitution. What is the meaning of sale? Then Justice Venkatram Iyer in Gannon Dankali's case said, sale, though not defined in the Constitution, will have the same meaning as the Sale of Goods Act. Because in Sale of Goods Act has been defined, the legislative practice has been to follow the definition in the Sale of Goods Act, and therefore the word sale in the Constitution will take the meaning from the Sale of Goods Act. So you may tomorrow come across a meaning of what is the meaning of the word import or export. Then you may have to use to a statutory provision which has been followed for a long amount of time. That will be also used when interpreting the Constitution. Now, motive not relevant. You cannot attribute motives to legislature. Exception is Sarbanda Sonowal, where on the migration issue, Justice G.C. Mathur observed that this legislation itself is mala fide. There's one example I've seen. I don't know what others, but to my research, limited research, this is the decision. And foreign decisions are applicable, but please take it with a pinch of salt. If you take, for example, Beram, Pesikaka, and other judgment, they say, before you apply a foreign judgment, you see in what context it was rendered. Like if you take in this Sushant Singh Rajput case, which I was arguing, it was very clear that the US judgments on freedom of speech may not apply because their First Amendment is of the US Constitution is very, very wide. There are no 19(2) restrictions. So we all agreed that US judgments will not be referred to because that's in a different situation altogether. Australia, our Part 13, that is interstate trade and commerce, is very similar to Australia. Those judgments will be applicable. So you see in what context these judgments can be utilized. Now, going in future, what is bothering me is we keep saying wisdom of legislature, motive not relevant, and so on. What happens if an act is introduced in Parliament, passed without any debate, without any discussion? Can you say it really represents the intention of the people, will of the people, wisdom of Parliament? In England, every bill goes to 3 readings. It has to be examined over 3 times for all mistakes, corrections, etc., and then you go. In our country also, there is a system of referring it to parliamentary committees. I have myself given evidence thrice with the parliamentary committee. And believe me, I developed a healthy respect for members of parliament. They came for these meetings fully prepared. They grilled us and asked so many pertinent questions. And they made their recommendations. Some were accepted, some were not. But the point is, the debate goes through. You may or may not agree with me, but at least you hear the other side. So I felt that whether it is Aadhaar or whether it is the Farm Bill, etc., it could have been, or NJSC for that matter, you introduce it at 6 o'clock, you pass it at 8 o'clock, far-reaching amendment is made. It may not be a healthy practice. Will that be a question? Second thing which is bothering me, we say there is no legislative estoppel. I don't know if it's time to think about that once again, because if one parliament has made an assurance for 10 years, can another parliament come in with it and say, take away that exemption in the next, suppose in the last year of its government, they make certain things and say, we'll give you special exemptions for 10 years. The new government comes. Can it take away all those powers? Can it take away those exemptions? If there is no overriding public interest, can it be questioned? So these are the points which I think will come for hearing over the next few years. They may not take that legislature, whatever it says is completely sacrosanct. We'll have to re-examine some of these principles. Next. Now, these are the common doctrines. I just quickly run through them because all of you are familiar with it. One is colorable legislation. That is, you have certain powers, but the power is exercised for oblique purposes or for wrong motive, and that becomes colorable. The classic example is Bihar Ordinance, which is DC Wadhwa's case, where the governor can promulgate an ordinance. Wonderful judgment by Justice Bhagwati, where DC Wadhwa, who was basically an economist, he found out that in Bihar, an ordinance was promulgated, then it would lapse before the next assembly started. The moment the assembly was over, again the ordinance would be promulgated. So the same ordinance will be re-promulgated 15 times, 16 times, 20 times. Then the Supreme Court said, this is a colorable exercise of power. Why do you get ordinance powers? You can't wait till the assembly is in session. Urgent require a law to be made. Therefore, go for an ordinance. Now, if that is the scope of the ordinance, and to repeatedly start making ordinances without facing the legislature, it's a colorable. Fifth and substance, in my opinion, is the most important doctrine in the context of legislative competence. Now, when you go for legislative competence, the state government passes a law. For example, the state government passes a law seeking to levy licensing of software. They say licensed software amounts to a sales. Now, we can argue that when you license the software, no transfer of property takes place. They have no such power. It's not within list 2. Then you test that law, taxing of licensing of software. In fifth and substance, what is it? Is it a tax relating to sale or is it a tax relating to service? If it's in service, then it will come into the union list. So fifth and substance is extremely important. In the old days, for example, Debt Relief Act. They gave debt relief, which is part of list 2. Somebody said if the debts are taken on pro notes and negotiable instruments, it will come under list 1 because the law relating to negotiable instruments is only parliamentary law. Even cancelling a negotiable instrument can only be done by parliament. In a wonderful judgment of the federal court, I think Muthuswamy Rounder versus the federal court held debt relief law. What is it? What is the pith and substance of the law? What is the basic essential feature of that law? If the essential feature is debt relief, then even though it may affect negotiable instruments incidentally, it's only an incidental drenching. It will not be a matter of parliament's competence. State government can levy. Please see the judgment of Jayant Verma, 2018, where Justice Nariman has gone into a very applied this law to an extreme level. There was an amendment to the Banking Regulation Act. You know, in debt relief, you can give interest moratorium. Right? The Banking Regulation Act said that if the loan is given by a scheduled bank or a nationalized bank, the state government cannot reduce the rent. Follow me carefully. If the loan is given by a bank, the state can't reduce the rent, it can't give a moratorium. Just Nariman held that agricultural indebtedness, particularly for farmers, is a state subject. In pith and substance, this is a state subject. Even though it may affect bank interest, which comes under list 1, it is not invalid. Many observations have been made in this Jayant Verma's case, where they here discuss completely the scope of list 2, list 1, etc. and discuss the whole thing. Incidentally, the judgment is also important because he discusses what's the meaning of a semicolon. A lot of discussion is there on the significance of a semicolon. Another problem. Now the Supreme Court is following a Canadian Supreme Court. This is where they have followed a Canadian law and said that, you know, now for example, advocates, we pay profession tax. Entry 60 of list 2 says tax on professions. So who can levy a tax on our profession? State government. Central government, nothing to say. Same thing for chartered accountants. For architects, any profession, tax can only be by state government. But Parliament levied service tax on lawyers. We challenged it unsuccessfully. Supreme Court said no. In advocate, there are two aspects. When you enroll, the right to practice is one aspect. When you actually practice is a different aspect. So when you actually practice and render service, you'll be liable to service tax. Whereas if you enroll and you don't practice at all, or you're not having any practice at all, you still have to pay profession tax. Whereas service tax is paid only when you render service. So for us, it's on reverse charge, but the client pays the service tax. But this is how aspect theory was applied. According to me, it is completely wrong, and it has no place in our constitution, is my humble view. Anyway, next. Harmonious construction. Beautiful example is Venkatramana Devaru, again Venkatramana judgment, where the reconciliation between 25 and 26 has been done extremely well. 25 says all temples will be thrown open to the public. Article 26 said that each denomination can manage, has the right to administer its own temples and affairs. Now, in the excess of my right to manage, can I prohibit certain communities from coming in? So Venkatramana here reconciled 25 and 26. They said, yes, you have the right to manage your own temples, but that will be subject to 25 rights. Your right will not apply to public temples, and therefore he reconciled it. There are many, many examples where, particularly entry 52 of list 1 has been reconciled, mining has been reconciled between center and state, 19 has been reconciled with other articles. Now again in Sabrimala, how are you going to harmoniously construct Article 14 vis-a-vis 25? Right to practice religion vis-a-vis 25. Can I say Article 26 is my right to administer my temple? For historic reasons, I don't allow women within a certain age group to come to the temple. But there is 14. So how do you reconcile 14 and 26 will now come before the 7 judges. Severability. Classic cases R&D Chamar Bagwala. If there is a statutory provision and 3 sections are invalid, don't strike down the whole law. Strike down those 3 sections and preserve the remaining part. Of course, if you strike down, say, the definition section or the basic charging section or the basic important point, if after striking that down nothing remains or nothing worthwhile remains, the whole act has to go. Occupied field is going to be a very big problem in the months to come. especially in federalism. You have got this farm bill which is coming up. As you know, Punjab and another court, they have made their own farm laws, contrary to what the central government has done. Can they do it, first of all? If Parliament has already occupied the field, can any other law be there? Secondly, will it come to presidential assent? If presidential assent comes, what happens? Does Punjab have a separate farm law? All those questions are going to come in occupied field, especially in the context of this three. Reading down is another doctrine. You don't strike down the law, but you read it down. You don't declare a particular provision as bad, but you read it down. For example, tax on sale. You may say sale will exclude a particular category. Don't strike it down. Reduce the rigor of that law. Another very, very important matter coming is proportionality. What is the, in modern dental college, a particular law can be struck down for the purpose of proportionality. If the law is disproportionate to the evil sought to be remedied, there is some evil, there is some problem in society, you make a law. Now, you can strike it down if it is disproportionate. And very often reading down and proportionality go together. If it is disproportionate, to the extent it is not proportionate, you can read down that particular statutory provision. Suppose, for example, in right to free speech and expression, you impose huge restrictions on electronic media. Now there is a huge clamor that there must be regulation of social media. Suppose you impose some laws. If the restrictions are draconian, they're very drastic, then you can read them down to make it workable. Don't strike down the whole law, read it down. Please see further. My colleague and I, we wrote an article. I can send it to Srinivas Raghavan on interpretation of the Constitution. Where
Sir, share with them, sir.
I send it to you by email. You can share it to the participants.
Yes, sir.
Where we have discussed all the possible doctrines of textual interpretation, original interpretation, what it means, and so on. Now I'll quickly run through it. Textualist. Textualist means you just go by the plain meaning of the section. You can't find out what's the history, what the Constitutional Assembly said, etc., etc. But in my opinion, it doesn't work out in a constitution, because when you say life and liberty, what is the plain meaning of liberty? There is no such plain meaning. You have to understand it according to each decade, each society's requirements. But one method is to go by textual, and the judgment says that if the text is clear, then don't go further. Stop at item number 1. Don't go to 2, 3, 4, 5. Apply that 2, 3, 4, 5 and interpret the law carefully. Suppose, for example, now they say that reservation will apply even in promotion. Once the amendment is made, it is textual. There is no need to go into any other aspect. It is a plain language that not only reservation is there at the time of admission, it's also the time of promotion. Simple. Now, originalist. Robert Bork is the biggest proponent of originalist theory, where they say that you go by what the original founders wanted and you stick to that. Don't apply your own theories and develop. According to, in my humble submission, it's a narrow view. Very often the Constitution was framed in 1950, where the situation was different, the circumstances were different, the needs of society were different, technology was different. So we'll have to change with the times. But as I said, each has got its own place. Sometimes you may have to apply the originalist, apply the textualist. And what I find is these are all tools available to us, and we should use them according to what we require. Then is doctrinal. Doctrinal means pro precedence. As far as possible, like this principle of stare decisis, as far as possible, follow the principle of precedence. Unless absolutely necessary, don't depart from the earlier precedent. So if, and again the judgment will say, if a law has stood the test of time for 30, 40 years, unless there are very compelling reasons, please don't change that. Then prudential. Prudential theory, sorry, structural. Structural is very interesting. What they say is, when you're giving an interpretation, somebody challenged the validity of a particular provision. They say, what is the architecture of that statute? Say, for example, if you got a debt relief act, as I said, what is the purpose of the statute? What's a debt relief? Whom are they giving the reliefs? Why are they giving the reliefs? That again brings you the arrangement and the architecture of the statute. That is a ground to understand how you should interpret it. then you must interpret it so that the architecture is preserved, the essence of the law is preserved. You know, each of these theories in my note has got number of cases, articles, and so on, which we have discussed. Prudentialism is a new approach. And you can also note prudentialism is what is called in the recent judgment of recent judgment of Justice Sikri. What is the cost benefit involved? Now, suppose, for example, we tried our best in telecom, we didn't succeed. In the telecom matter, they had to pay the license fee. We had succeeded twice before the TDSAT. Now in 2019, you asked us to pay the amount from 2003, 2004, 92,000 crores. The interest is in the agreement, it is compounded at 15-day intervals. It is worse than a pawnbroker's interest. And there is interest on interest, interest on penalty. So now, if you're going to interpret it in that particular way, what is the benefit? What is the cost? Take, for example, banning of diesel cars or banning of alcohol in 500 meters. You make a judgment. There they say, when you stop all vehicles above 2,500 cc, the diesel ban, please consider what is the economic consequence. I had mentioned in Bhopal in the Judicial Academy, I said we are the only country where what is statutorily legal becomes judicially illegal. Under the Motor Vehicles Act, I've got license to run a 2,500 Innova vehicle. Supreme Court says anything about 2,500 is illegal. Now look at the consequence. They found that many of the ladies working in night shift in the BPOs, software, etc., they had to be dropped and picked up. They were all vehicles of Tempo Traveler or it was a 2,500 cc vehicle, which had to be suddenly stopped. What about the dealers who had placed orders, who had done bookings? Car manufacturers had booked. I appeared for 2 car companies. They said, we plan 5 years in advance. We expect the demand. Suddenly you change the law. So this economic consequence is a very, very important part which we have to take into account. Liquor ban, for example. People have set up hotels, people have set up class thing. Suddenly you say, sorry, you have to ban liquor and find it. This is what John Fuller calls the polycentric nature of a dispute. He says like a spider's web. By banning a vehicle, you're affecting car dealers, affecting women working in BPOs, affecting cab drivers. People who have taken loans, how do they repay the loan? Nobody follows. So this is the prudentialism. It's a very interesting concept. And Oxford University Press has published a 3-volume set on law and economics, where they go into the interplay of law and different economic theories. And of course, this is one of the greatest judges, Aaron Barak from Israel. He has written a book on purposive interpretation. It is available. I would request all of you to buy it. And the purposive interpretation, where he says, what is the purpose of the law? When I'm interpreting a law, what is the purpose? Like Justice Nariman judgment in Jayant Verma's case. Debt relief. What is the purpose? Purpose is to grant debt relief. If I keep the National Banking Regulation Amendment, this purpose will be defeated. So can I harmoniously construe both and say, yes, debt relief will also apply to banks. They can't charge because they found that even banks are charging penal interest. Interest on interest, etc. It has come in more than 20-24%. The farmers, because of drought, could not pay. He harmonized and said, keeping in mind the purpose of interpretation, will do it. Then the again excellent example of how Supreme Court is slowly and in many cases adopting purposive interpretation. Next. Yeah, I think I've completed my. So we are on an endless, fascinating journey of constitutional interpretation, where all that I've told you, there is nothing hard and fast of any particular rule. What I would suggest is when you're arguing a writ petition or arguing a case, keep all these tools with you, which can be used at what point of time. Can I use the structural argument? Can I use the prudential argument? Suppose a particular law is having economic consequences. Then you can go to the prudential school. Suppose we are trying to, suppose the social welfare legislation, which is being challenged. See the architecture. Why was this law made? What is the arrangement? What is the way in which this law is being drafted? that can be read with purpose. Sometimes 2-3 things can be read together. You can have purposive with structural. You can have purpose with the original. You can say that if you take the originalist approach, the purpose will be defeated. So it's a fascinating theory where you have to keep thinking and thinking and thinking and structure your argument. So thank you so much. I can keep talking, but I think time is almost 4:45. I'll stop. If any questions are there, I'll be happy to answer.
Sir, there are people waiting here. Probably some of your good old friends are there.
Yes.
May I request Mr. T.V. Shivakumar to offer his remarks.
Very nice of you. I heard a beautiful lecture as usual. Wonderful.
No,
Thank you.
it got kept getting delayed. I told Srinivas Raghavan 2-3 times I had to postpone it for some reason or the other. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Srimati.
Good evening.
Good evening.
How is Mrs. Himani, sir?
Oh. In fact, there are 2 questions from her, so I'm waiting to.
Pardon?
Any doubts also, any questions to ask, I can.
So I may say one thing, sir. It is called, the lecture was precise, concise, short and sweet. And may I have one more personal question, sir? Are you an ardent James Bond fan? I got 2 clues. Number 1, your car registration number ends with 007.
It used to. I sold that car, unfortunately.
Oh, I'm sorry. Then your ringtone is the famous theme music of James Bond movies. Am I right? Yenal Raja told me that you are an ardent James Bond fan.
In fact, I was very, very sad to see him passing away at 90. And for all of you, I've got the James Bond encyclopedia. His movie, all the guns, all the villains, all the points, everything. So the whole thing is.
Yes. Then you must have felt sorry for Mr. Sean Connery's death.
Yes, yes.
Thank you, Miss.
He was the original Bond.
Original Bond, the one and the only Bond. Anyway, thank you, Mr. Datta. I think we can have one more session later with all the interactions.
Thank you.
Thanks for your time and energy. It was an insightful and very useful and constructive session we had so far.
I hope. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you.
Everybody a very happy Diwali and happy and prosperous, healthy Diwali. I hope next year Diwali we don't have this problem. We can all meet personally and interact.
Personally, not virtually.
This screen is not a very happy situation.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. We reciprocate and wish you back. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.